You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Tron Ares has arrived.
Hostiles. Repeat, we have hostiles. Mayday.
Oh my God, there's hundreds of them.
On October 10th,
we came here from the digital world.
the war for our world begins.
What in God's name is that?
In IMAX.
This is the end for this world.
No, it's not. But I can help you.
Tron Ares, rated PG-13, may be inappropriate for children under 13. Only in theaters October 10th. Get tickets now.
Netflix has a new, monstrous story to tell. In 1950s Wisconsin, Ed Gein lived quietly on a decaying farm, hiding a house of horrors so gruesome it would redefine the American nightmare. Driven by isolation, psychosis, and an all-consuming obsession with his mother, he committed crimes that would haunt Hollywood for decades. The third and most harrowing installment of Ryan Murphy and Ian Brennan's anthology series. Watch Monster, the Ed Gein story, streaming now only on Netflix.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another History of the Second World War interview. Today, I'm joined by Richard Hargreaves, the author of the recently released book, Opening the Gates of Hell, Operation Barbarossa, June to July 1941. Richard, thank you for joining me here today. I hope everything is going well across the pond.
It is. Thank you very much, yes, and thank you for inviting me on your podcast.
Absolutely. So, Richard, I have a question for you. For the last many years, you've been a journalist writing about naval news. Operation Barbarossa is about as far away from the Navy as you can get. So what brought you to write a book on this campaign?
Well, I try to keep my day job and my hobby semi-separate, although obviously my journalism influences the way I write. But beyond that, why Barbarossa? It's a fascinating subject. It's still, after 80 years, there's still so much to be written about, so many aspects of it. The archives are still throwing up new material, new documents, particularly new personal diaries, reminiscences, memoirs, letters, and there hasn't been a study on the opening phases in the way I've written mine in probably 20 years. The last one was a guy called Robert Kershaw, who did something called War Without Garlands, which is a fantastic book. That's probably the last real attempt at doing something similar to mine. You got a guy called David Starhull, who's done a lot of work on the Eastern Front in 1941, but he's generally more he's what I call a professional military historian. He knows his stuff, and he's very much on the operationally focused. For me, it's about the human stories, or the inhuman stories, as the case is in this particular book. So it's about what it was like to be a soldier, a tank crew member, a fighter pilot, and all member of the public. You know, whoever is swept up in this cataclysmic event over 2 to 3 weeks in June, July 1941. That's what I wanted to convey with the book.
And it's interesting that you bring that up, because I think one of the problems with Operation Barbarossa is that it is just mind-bogglingly huge, right? It is millions of men across such a wide front that only gets larger in the first couple of weeks and in the first months of the campaign. So as an author looking to sit down and write a book about this thing, like, how do you approach such a massive topic?
Well, it actually started out as a very specific, quite a small book, because it was meant to be about the history of the Brest Fortress, which is sort of pivotal place certainly in the first week of Barbarossa. It's sort of the only place that really stands firm and holds out against the German onslaught. And I was about a year into researching it. I'd been out to visit it. I'd done a lot of work in the archives. And then a British publisher published a book on exactly the same subject, written on a Russian bloke. So it was like, bugger, what do I do now? So I looked around and thought, well, I don't want to kill all this research on it. It's cost me a lot of money, spent a lot of time doing it, and I picked up some good stuff. But I'd also picked up quite a lot of other material at the same time doing the research. So I thought, well, why not spread it out and widen it to a wider subject? And you look at what material's out there, you look at how much you think you can do yourself to keep the book within limited, time scales, pagination, that sort of thing. So you got to be realistic. I couldn't write this book in the way I've written it all the way through to December, because it would be 10, 20 volumes. So I limited it to a specific cut-off point, and therefore I picked Why did I pick July the 3rd? Two reasons. One, it's where Stalin sort of emerges from his so-called hiding. Nobody's seen or heard of him in 10, 12 days of the invasion. So that's when he makes his famous speech. But it's also less well known, but if you're a historian of the period, you'll know that there's a chief of the general staff in Germany, a guy called Franz Halder. He makes an entry in his diary on that day, which basically says, "Hey, the war's won. All we've got to do now is mop up the remnants." So it seemed a sort of contrast between Stalin coming out and fighting, the Germans going, "Yeah, we won. We're just going to keep mopping up." So it seemed as good a place to end it, and it's also roughly around where the first phases of the operation ends. So around the 1st of July, you've got places like Riga falling, you've got Lviv in the Ukraine falling, you've got the battle for, or the massive battle in the pockets west of Minsk, they're just about over. So that's really the first phase of Barbarossa ending. So as any, if it was going to be a cut-off point, there was going to be a good one, and there's plenty of material to deal with, then that's as good a place as anywhere to stop.
The one unifying theme of Barbarossa for the first weeks and months is the Germans constantly writing in their diaries, "Hey, we've won now. We're all good now," and it never is.
It comes across well. You said that there's also quite a lot of pessimism in there as well, because they sort of they reach a point, say Minsk or beyond, and they look eastwards, and all they see is flat plains, endless distances. They're still, even after the amazing rapid advance in those first 10, 12 days, they're still hundreds and hundreds of miles from their objectives. Moscow is still 500, 600 miles away. Leningrad is slightly closer. Kiev is a lot closer, but they're really, that's only a partial objective. They're really aiming for Rostov on Don, which is again insane distances away from where they are on July the 3rd. So whilst there's certainly in the diaries of both senior, intermediate, and sort of junior soldiers, there's a real mishmash of feelings of some people, were convinced of one. You have Ritter von Lieb, the Army Group North commander. He's planning all his headquarters all the way up to outside Leningrad, and yet you have other soldiers. Gotthard Heinrich, who ends up right at the end of the war becoming sort of one of the last defenders of Berlin. Probably one of the best and most sober frontline commanders there is in 1941, and he's after the fighting around Minsk and Bialystok, he's saying, "Hell, if this is what it's going to be like here, imagine what it's like for the rest of the war." So he doesn't see any sort of prospect. And then you got the ordinary soldiers who half of them, believe that their next stop is Moscow, and the other half think, "My God, how the hell are we going to get through this?" So it's quite a mixed bag. It's much more nuanced than you actually think, and certainly much more nuanced than the propaganda. If you watch the newsreels of 1941, it's nothing but endlessly marching troops and panzers rolling east with no opposition whatsoever. So it's definitely not a case of we won the war on July the 3rd, other than sort of a smallish number, surprisingly. And obviously the public back home in Germany, they're also all the unions lapping up the newsreels and the communiques, which don't really give any indication. So they're still fairly confident of victory as well. But obviously it doesn't come.
It's interesting, thinking about Barbarossa, and like the image that most people have in their mind is like, as you mentioned, like it is German tanks driving endlessly across flat plains without any opposition. But you also mentioned that this kind of effort for you started at Brest, right? The fortress of Brest, which is the complete opposite of that, right? So it is a group of Russian soldiers holding out for far longer than is you would expect, right at the border. So kind of what drew you to that story initially, right? So what kind of what brought you there, and what did you find surprising, especially when you traveled there?
Well, about Brest Fortress.
Yeah.
Brest Fortress it's one of those things that you sort of read about, and there's a lot of propaganda books, and it always looks impressive in documentaries and photographs. Particularly with the Soviet era memorials that they built in the grounds. So it's one of those places that you're fascinated by but also because it's the one place in June. It's one of the main places in June 1941 that does hold out. There's a lot of lot of collapses and people surrendering in vast numbers. But in Brest, they don't. Partly because partly that's down to circumstances. There's nowhere else to go. They initially they hold out because they think they're going to be rescued from the outside, and that sort of dies a death after 2 or 3 days. They realise that no, probably not going to be rescued. So therefore, they basically make a vow to sell their lives as dearly as they can to make sure that the fascist invaders don't get, if they do take Brest Waters, they're going to take it at a price. It's a fascinating place to visit. I mean, it's a shame at the moment that you can't because of obviously the situation in Eastern Europe. But when the borders reopen one day, it's one of those absolute must places to visit for a World War II historian. It really does evoke what it was like, and it's actually a lot of the sort of Soviet memorials are quite tacky and things, but Brest is done very well. You walk there and it's a very moving place. It's almost like a sort of peace park these days. So for all the horror that it's seen, you'll in the evenings you'll see families gathering there, having picnics, pushing prams around. Kids will be playing on the bikes and that sort of thing. So considering all the horror that's been there, it's quite what's the word? Yeah, it's very pleasant to see that something that's in such horror is now at peace, and fingers crossed it'll never be fought over again.
Absolutely, absolutely. If I remember correctly, it got made a hero city of the Soviet
Yeah,
Union later on. Yeah.
and even today, there are. I mean, it's still treated as a heroic monument. So during term time at school, the cadets from the local senior schools all perform the Guard of Honor there. So there's an eternal flame permanently going. And during the daytime, they do the sort of teenage cadets do their thing, sort of standing guard around the flame. I was there when it wasn't term time, so I didn't see that, but it's still a very powerful place to visit.
Yeah.
And the other thing that strikes me is that for a place that's been that's a fortress and is fortress is supposed to be impregnable. It's actually been captured quite a few times in the 20th century. The Germans captured it in World War One. They captured it again in 1939. Then they handed it back to the Russians. There's a famous parade through Brest where you see Guderian saluting alongside the Soviet general who was handed the city. So it's that sort of the wheel of history is another thing that always fascinates me, and certainly there's quite a lot of that in 1941. Again, Lviv, known as Lemberg, to Germans, known as Lvov, to Poles. That again was captured in 1939 by the Germans when it's part of Poland. As part of the Nazi-Soviet pact. That part of Ukraine, Poland, is called Galicia, is handed over to the Soviet Union, handed over, just basically taken, seized by Stalin. So that becomes an occupied part of the USSR, and so therefore you find that in 1939 Germans are fighting the same place they fought in 1939 for the second time round, which again is fascinating and shows you the utter stupidity of conflict.
Yeah, the futility for sure. Hey guys, millions of men have problems with ED every year. Maybe that's you. Maybe you don't want to talk about it because nobody wants to talk about it, but it happens. And RexMD is here to help. RexMD is a licensed provider of ED medication, and it starts with just a short, simple quiz to help determine the best path forward for you. Everybody is different. There are no one-size-fits-all treatments, but RexMD has all of the options. Oh, and after some private consultations, your personal treatment arrives directly to your door in discreet packaging. You are not alone. RexMD has been chosen by 475,000 men. So if you need to be ready when the mood strikes, head on over to rexmd.com/SWW to get up to 95% off your ED treatment. See full details and usage at rexmd.com. Prescription required. Results may vary. Visit rexmd.com/SWW and get up to 95% off your ED treatment. Thank you, RexMD, for sponsoring this episode.
Once upon a mundane morning, Barb's day got busy without warning. A realtor in need of an open house sign. No, 50 of them, and designed before 9.
My head hurts.
Any mighty tools to help with this plight?
Aha!
Barb made her move. She opened Canva and got in the groove.
Bulk creating Canva sheets. Create 50 signs fit for suburban streets.
Done in a click, all complete.
Sweet!
Now, imagine what your dreams can become when you put imagination to work at canva.com.
You mentioned there kind of Soviets taking over some territory in Eastern Europe. And one of the complicating parts of the Barbarossa story, even in these first couple weeks that you cover, are kind of the thoughts and experiences of groups trapped between the two armies. I'm thinking specifically of Lithuanians, Estonians, Latvians, Ukrainians, those kind of groups that have, let's call it a complicated relationship with the Soviets and with the Germans as well. So sort of why were these groups in such an awkward position, and what were their experiences during the beginning of the invasion?
Okay, so again, as part of the not Soviet backed, the Baltic states come under the Soviet sphere of influence, and June 1940, when everybody's looking at France and Paris and the Wehrmacht sort of running riot in the West, Stalin sees his chance and just seizes the three Baltic states. It's already taken most of what he wants from Ukraine, Poland, the previous September. But he waits until this opportune moment when the world is looking elsewhere and doesn't really take much notice of what's happening in the Baltic states, which are all independent. They all fought for their independence from the Soviet Union, stroke Russia at the end of the First World War. They gained it at pretty high cost, but they're all staunchly independent nations with a very wary eye of what's what's happening in Moscow. And it proves to be right in June 1940 that they're swallowed up by the USSR, which imposes its regime against the will of probably 95% of the public. In imposing its regime, the Soviets give. Oh, it's hard to describe this. They give fuel to anti-Semitism in the region because they open up certain areas of society which were barred to Jews. So there's a feeling by some in Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia that the Jews have benefited from the Soviet rule, and the same goes for Galicia in Ukraine. There's very little truth in this, and they ignore the fact that any Jewish business owners, of which there were many, they all lose their jobs because all their properties is taken over by the state. So if there are Jewish beneficiaries, there are also a hell of a lot of Jewish losers. But this sort of seething and anti-Semitism will come back to really bite in the first days of Barbarossa across the entire Eastern Front, but particularly Lithuania, Latvia, and Ukraine.
I don't know. It's always so complicated when you get into those kind of groups and those kind of situations, and then the Germans come in and in some ways maybe work with some of those groups, but then later kind of lump them in with the Russians. So it's kind of it's sad to read about, really. Like when you read about the whole story of those peoples, it's just sad is usually how I feel.
I mean, when the Germans come into these regions, they are treated as liberators. There's no other word for it. The photographs back it up as well. The newsrooms back it up. These aren't staged. There are people handing out salt and bread and water and milk and flowers and chocolates. You name it. There are women throwing themselves at the advancing German troops. They are seen as delivering Lithuania, Latvia, and eventually Estonia and Ukraine from an evil. They're not realizing that the evil that's replacing the previous evil is even worse. but there's this sort of certainly in certain areas there's an interregnum between German law and rule being imposed and enforced, and the Soviets leaving, and in that gap, there are the most horrific pogroms, attacks, assaults. Pogrom is probably the best word because it's widespread and it's massive, particularly, and it's really focused on certain cities. So Kaunas, which was the interwar capital of Lithuania, Vilnius, which is the current capital, several other towns as well, and also Riga when the Germans get there on sort of beginning of July. But the one that really strikes me as the worst is a place called Kaunas, which the Germans reach on about the third or fourth day of the attack, and by then the pogrom's already well underway. They literally just round people up. The word that they use, and I don't know, my Lithuanian's not very good, but they call it napomi, which means revenge. And that was a word on everybody's lips in June 1941. And they basically, there's no hiding these attacks. They beat people to death in the streets. They'll knock on people's doors, on the homes of Jewish people, and they will haul them out. They will beat them to death in the streets. There's a what can only be described as a sort of concentration camp set up on the edge of Kaunas in an old 19th century fort, and over several days there, stretching into early July, the sort of militia who fill the void of lawlessness end up butchering several thousand Lithuanian Jews for no other reason than they are being Jews. They literally, men, women, children, babies, old people, doesn't matter. They are shot. They are blown up with hand grenades. They are beaten to death. Probably one of the most horrific events is in a garage forecourt in the middle of Kaunas, 5 minutes walk from the central station. So there's no hiding it. It's whereas the fort was out of town, you had to make the effort to go there. This garage forecourt is slap bang on a main road, and they bring numbers. Numbers have never really been fully verified, but several hundred Jews are brought there, and they are beaten to death with clubs, literally on the forecourt. And what makes it particularly horrific is that the crowd watches, and the crowd isn't watching in a sort of a stunned, appalled manner. The crowd is watching this as this is Holocaust entertainment. They are lifting their kids up onto their shoulders, saying, "Watch this, watch this, watch the Jews get their penance for what they've done to us." There's people playing the accordions and they're singing the national anthem. Some people are taking photographs, and there's a chap. He's known as the Death Dealer of Kaunas, and he's literally wielding this huge wooden club, beating them to death. And they are, the forecourts is literally running with blood, and this goes on for certainly a day. And the Germans know about it because there's a German photographer there. There are several German soldiers watching it. There's certainly an officer watching it from Lieb's staff, all making notes. Did they intervene? No, they let them. They're pretty appalled by it. In fairness, they're pretty horrified about what they're seeing, but they let it get. They let it go. Today, if you go to Kaunas, it's the forecourt's gone. It's now, I think it's a school building or it's a school car park, but there's not much of a memorial there, and you'll find that quite a lot in a lot of these places. Whilst I make a lot of subsequent atrocities, so there's another fort in Kaunas, I think it's called Fort 9, which is a huge memorial. Everybody, all the school kids taken there in the same way that in Poland, you'll take the kids to Auschwitz to show them here's what the Germans did to your people on our soil, blah, etc., etc. The fort at Fort 9, big. I'd say tourist attraction is probably the wrong word, but people learn all about the Nazi atrocities that have been committed. Oh, the horrors of Nazism, blah blah blah. But that there's that blind spot of here's what Lithuanians did to fellow Lithuanians for several days in June to July 1941. The one exception is the fort where the murders took place, which is now it's now sort of science lab for kids. So they've turned the site into a sort of place of learning, but there are memorials there, and they acknowledge what was done by Lithuanians. But that's pretty rare, and that's pretty rare across the Baltic states. Most people, in fact, it's pretty rare across all Eastern Europe. During my research for this, I went to a place called Iași in Romania, and which is a site of another horrific atrocity, again committed by the public. And I thought, as part of research, I want to go to the Jewish cemetery because that's where the mass graves are. And I got in a taxi driving out there. Obviously, my Romanian's pretty limited, and the taxi driver, yeah, she did speak a couple of words of English, and I sort of tried to explain to him in pidgin Romanian stroke English why I was going there. And I remember his words quite precisely. He said, "Yash, no Jews, no Jews. Hitler, Hitler." So again, it's that blind spot. They know these atrocities happened, but they'll quickly blame them on the Germans. Whereas probably 50% of the murders committed in 1941 of Jews is committed by the native population, not by the invader. And like I say, this is repeated all across Eastern Europe. Most places do not accept their role in those those early days of the Holocaust.
So common to see, places have sort of issues with those complicated legacies, right? Of the complicated things that have happened in the past, and often choosing to bury it and blaming it on somebody else. In this case, they do have the Nazis to blame, who did their own share of atrocities. So,
Before I keep blaming I can't blame the native population entirely. The Germans did some horrific things, and I'm not talking about the SS. I'm not talking about the Nazi authorities. I'm talking about the German army. It has its hands bloodied from day one, be it killing commissars to it's basically given carte blanche in May 1941 by what's known as a set of criminal orders, whereby it can pretty much act as it pleases against anybody it suspects as being hostile to Germany. And there's no trials, there's no after investigation. It's literally shoot first, ask questions later. And the worst of it is a place called Bialystok, which today is in Poland, but in 1941 was swallowed up as part of a part of the USSR. And the Germans arrived there about 5 days into the campaign, and the city falls fairly easily. There's not too much resistance. And by lunchtime on, I think it's on the Friday of a Friday of Barbarossa, so that would be the 27th. So by lunchtime, the city's in German hands. There's a bit of the odd sort of pot shot being taken by a few Red Army stragglers, but beyond that, it's as secure and safe as anywhere can be in the middle of a war. And then a police a security division arrives, the German army, filled with a load of police from the Rhineland, who promptly go on an absolute rampage through the city. They seal off the Jewish quarter. They burn down the synagogue with people in it. Shoot people. Anybody who tries to escape, and basically let the fires rage. Their commander spends most of the time in a drunken stupor, refusing to either intervene or he's just happy for it to carry on. And by the day's end, several thousand Jews are dead. Most of the Jewish quarters burnt to a crisp. The synagogue's gone. All that's left is it's the sort of frame of its dome. Again, it's one of those places where now, if you go back, there's a little memorial to what happened, but it's largely forgotten. Mainly because most of the Jews of Bialystok, if they weren't killed by the army in 1941, ended up in the ghetto, and ended up at Auschwitz or one of the other death camps that the Nazis erected in Poland. So it's reading about these things is some of the worst things that I've ever dealt with in Southern history, and it's the only book I've had to put almost a sort of an 18X, do not read almost, because you have to put a warning in it because it is so grim. You really, it's hard to believe that people were so utterly brutal, sadistic, and this isn't just on the invaders. This is the defenders as well, because hand in hand with the atrocities committed by the Germans and their allies, supporters, you also have widespread atrocities, particularly in Ukraine, committed by the retreating Soviet authorities, mainly the NKVD, who are ordered to evacuate the prisons of the region. Obviously, the rapidity of the German advance basically largely rules it out. But rather than simply let the prisons fall into the hands of the Germans with the prisoners still in them, most of them are political, so they're all opponents of Stalin. They are they are killed, and they're killed in the most bestial manners. You see some of the stuff that they make the death dealer of Konus look like your local priest. They carve bodies up. They sort of tattoo people with so any priests that were taken prisoner often would be strung up. They'd have crosses branded into them. Some pregnant women would have their unborn child cut out of the body and then stuffed into somebody else's body. They would wall people up alive. It's straight out of the Middle Ages. It really is, and this is largely focused on the big cities of Ukraine. So probably the worst is Lviv, and it's also heavily documented because when the Germans arrived there, the Ukrainians and the Poles are just about beginning to discover what's happened. So they start interrogating people. They make meticulous records. So these are all documented now. How accurate is the testimony? There's probably a bit of embellishment in there, but my guess is that most of this is accurate because you're interviewing people like janitors, you're interviewing like farmers. I can't really see them having the imagination to have read something that's straight out of Dante's Inferno. So I generally take most of their accounts at face value. And once these atrocities become known, then you have a fresh wave of pogroms in Lviv, and that is every bit as horrific as what the NKVD have done, and that runs again till June 3rd or 4th. And that is all captured on camera by the Germans. So if you look hard enough on the internet, you will find video or film footage of Jews being driven through the streets of Lviv by howling, mad Ukrainians and Poles equal for revenge. Some of the stills on the screen grab some are just people in utter terror. Again, there's very little evidence that any of these people had anything to do with the atrocities, but they're Jewish, therefore they are singled out. At least as many die from the pogroms as has been killed in the prison massacres.
I think one of the challenges I've had in the past, and I know I've talked to other historians who have this as well, is like when talking about these kind of things, like it's like you it's really important to like dig into the details in a couple of these instances, right, to kind of show what it was like. But then you have to make it very clear that like these were not exceptions, like these were not like one-off events, right? It was happening everywhere. I can't run through every single instance.
Yeah.
I can't, and also there's probably instances we don't even know about anymore, right? There's probably a huge number of atrocities that weren't documented. The people involved did not survive, right? And it's like trying to make sure that people understand that like these horrible things that are happening, it's not just the examples I'm talking about here or writing about here. It's happening everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. And I suppose if there's any good that comes out of this is that these probably fade. These what I call this is what I call the spontaneous Holocaust. These pogroms and things. They probably fade out by mid-July. That's partly because by then the evacuations that are taking place from the Russians are getting more and more time to evacuate the prisons. The German advance is slowing, so they're not making that rapid move. And dare I say, they've run out of people to kill. But certainly by July, mid-July, this first wave of killings has largely ended. And then you get the more organised. You get the Einsatzgruppen coming in behind the front line. Then you start the ghettos being established, and the SS setting up its hideous machinery. But certainly during that first month of Barbarossa, the German army is fully aware what's going on. It's heavily involved in many of the atrocities. it's certainly committing its crimes itself, be it shooting hostages, villagers, and obviously widespread killing of commissars. Uh, After the war, the Germans will, the German army will try and portray itself as, these are Hitler's orders and they weren't carried out, or they weren't carried out on my watch. But the contemporary documents prove otherwise. That pretty much every German division bloodied its hands in 1941 by killing off political commissars, and Red Army officers, widespread. It's not something that's uncommon.
Kind of looking back at this work that you've done, after the research in the book and after writing it, are there some additional areas of research that you would love for somebody to really dig into, or have the opportunity to dig into yourself, that or a certain type of source that we don't have, that you think would really help sort of better understand this period?
On 1941,
Yeah.
I would love Russia to be more open,
Mhm.
so you could actually get into access into some of their archives. And my Russian is limited, so I'd have to pay for interpreters. But for the people who have had the opportunity to go into Russian archives, and not just the central ones that keep the army, the party documents, but also at a regional level, I think that's where a lot of the gems can be found: personal diaries, accounts, documents from. Some people have had access to some of the pod documents from this period, and have found some really interesting stuff about how badly the Communist Party behaved in the first weeks of Barbarossa. It's portrayed as the all seeing, all knowing party, which does its utmost for the people. And generally speaking, in 1941, that's proven not to be the case. Most of the time, they just run like hares. They save their own skins. And the same when you look at Germany in 1945, the Nazi Party does exactly the same in reverse. Very few Gauleiters and their supporters did stand up to the advancing Red Army. So yeah, there's certainly a lot of material out there that I would like to see available to historians. Whether or not it changes the picture of the story that much more, probably not. It probably just embellishes probably what we already know, but it's always, you know as I said before, we're chatting. 80 years on from the end of the Second World War, there are still vast amounts of stories to be told, battles that people don't know in the West. I would say that the last 20 years has been a real shift, and there's been a lot of new material being published on the Eastern Front in particular, and some really, really good stuff. But yeah, there's still vast areas to cover.
So I know this book, you're done with this book. It's published. It's
Yeah,
out there. So the question is, do you have a new project that you're working on? Anything upcoming?
yes, my sequel, the sequel comes out next year,
Okay.
um, next June. It's called 1942:
Okay.
Hitler's Gamble for Victory. This takes a slightly different tone, so it covers the summer campaign, or the spring and summer campaigns in Russia and in North Africa, but it doesn't do it in the same detail. So it's not a minute by minute or hour by hour, day by day blow. It's much more a more typical sort of description of events. But the North Africa one's been a real eye opener because it's an area that I've not touched before, and I used a lot of Italian material, which was really eye opening. There's some great stuff in Italian archives and documents and books that hardly anybody's touched in the English language. So I'm hoping that will be of real interest to people. Everybody knows about Erwin Rommel and how wonderful Erwin Rommel was, the world's greatest champ, blah blah blah. But you realise that, I think probably two things really surprised me about researching North Africa. One is the paucity of German sources. So there's a lot of official documents, war diaries, that sort of thing. And Rommel himself has left masses of material as well as his memoirs. But there's not that much from ordinary soldiers. Maybe it's because they were either all captured or because it was small numbers. The material's just not out there. And the other is the vast amount of Italian material. If you read Italian material, they come across as very, very brave men. You know, our our, um, our sort of view of Italy in World War Two is still very much tainted by wartime propaganda. Their tanks have 5 years to go backwards and one to go forwards. That ain't the case if you read the accounts, both of the Italians themselves and also sometimes the British face of them. There are some pretty there's some pretty brave dashes done by the Italians. So that was really eye opening. The other side of it covers the fall of Sevastopol, which again is not on the Crimea. Has been touched a couple of times, but not in the way I treat war. So there's a couple of serious historical studies of the Crimean campaign. Mine's obviously much more in the journalistic, what it was like to be there. And then we've got the drive into Stalingrad, which is well covered ground. So I apologise for that. I've tried to dig out as many news sources as I can so that you're not reading the same old stuff that you've always read before. Fingers crossed I have. But I've also gone into the Caucasus, which is an area, again, which hasn't really been touched much in English literature. So things like the scaling of the highest summit in Europe, that features in the book, doesn't really feature many places in English literature. So the Caucasus is a fascinating campaign because the objectives there are as wide ranging and distant and ultimately unobtainable as Barbarossa itself, because they're setting goals from starting from Rostov on Don of reaching Baku and possibly driving down through the Middle East to link up with Rommel in Cairo in absolute dreamland with hindsight. But in 1942, there were people who believed this, which is fascinating, but also it's nice to put them right.
Well, thank you for joining me here today and chatting about your book and your upcoming project.
You're welcome.